Let's start with a truth most people have no idea about. Iran and Israel, two countries that today talk about wiping each other off the map, were once, not too long ago, shaking hands behind closed doors. Not just once or twice, they had a working relationship that was so real, so vital, that one supplied the other with fuel, weapons, intelligence, and access to international strategy. These two nations, now enemies, were for decades walking in step. No headlines, no fanfare, but deep, serious cooperation. It sounds crazy, right? But it happened. And to understand how they became bitter foes, you have to start with how they became friends. Now, long before any of this started, before Israel even existed as a country, there was already a long, complicated history between the Jewish people and the Persian Empire. It goes all the way back to the 6th century BCE, when the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and set the Jews free from exile. That moment is still remembered with gratitude in Jewish tradition. In fact, Cyrus is actually praised in the Hebrew Bible as someone chosen by God. Not bad for a non-Jewish king. And from that time on, Jews had lived in Persia, later called Iran, for centuries. They weren't outsiders. They were part of the fabric of society. By the early 20th century, Iran had the largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside of what would become Israel. But all of that is background noise until we get to the modern political scene. In the 1940s, Iran was ruled by a monarchy under Reza Shah, a man who had tried to modernize his country but ended up being pushed out during World War II by British and Soviet forces. They replaced him with his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. He was young, Western-leaning, and determined to transform Iran into a modern, powerful state. He looked to America and Europe for guidance and support, and once he was firmly in power, especially after 1953, when the CIA helped him crush his political opponents in a coup, he became one of America's closest allies in the region. And that alliance with the West opened the door to something that would have shocked many Muslims at the time: backdoor cooperation with the State of Israel. Israel was established in 1948 after a brutal war with surrounding Arab states. At the time, most of the Middle East rejected its existence. Iran officially voted against the United Nations partition plan in 1947 that recommended the division of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Publicly, Iran had to stand with its Muslim neighbors, many of whom saw Israel not just as a political problem, but as an offense against Islamic lands. So when Israel declared independence, Iran did not jump to recognize it or open diplomatic ties. On paper, it looked like they were on opposite sides. But the Shah wasn't just thinking about what looked good on paper. He saw something different. He saw Arab nationalism rising fast. Leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser were calling for pan-Arab unity, pushing Soviet-style politics, and encouraging revolutions across the region. Nasser wasn't just against Israel, he was against monarchies like Iran's too. The Shah understood that Arab nationalism wasn't going to stop with the Jews. It would come for him too. So while Iran said all the right things in public, behind closed doors, the Shah began quietly warming up to Israel. Not because he loved it, but because they shared a common enemy. This is where things started to get real. Israel, for its part, was desperate for friends. It was surrounded by enemies. Arab countries were closing in politically, diplomatically, and militarily. So Israel created what came to be known as the Periphery Doctrine. It was a strategy to reach out to countries on the edges of the Arab world, non-Arab states like Turkey, Ethiopia, and Iran, to build secret partnerships. If Israel couldn't be accepted in the neighborhood, it would build alliances with the neighbors of the neighborhood. And it worked. By the mid-1950s, Israel had opened a secret diplomatic mission in Tehran. Not a full embassy, just a small, quiet presence. Iran never fully recognized Israel publicly, but the doors were open, and over the next 2 decades, that small opening turned into a two-way pipeline for oil, weapons, intelligence, and mutual survival. It didn't matter that the rest of the Muslim world rejected Israel. The Shah didn't need their permission. Oil was the first big piece. Israel had almost no natural energy resources. It was blocked from buying oil from most of its neighbors because of the Arab boycott. But Iran had oil, and the Shah was willing to sell it. By the late 1960s and early 70s, Iran was supplying over half of Israel's oil imports. Some estimates say even more than that. This wasn't done through public deals. It was done through secret routes and third-party agreements, like the joint construction of the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline, which moved Iranian oil to the Mediterranean coast so Israel could export it further west. Most Israelis had no idea that their cars, homes, and airplanes were running on Iranian crude. But they were. In return, Israel provided Iran with advanced agricultural technology, water systems, arms, electronics, and military training. Israeli engineers and military advisors traveled to Iran frequently. They helped design infrastructure, train soldiers, and install radar systems. Israeli companies, often under other names, won major contracts inside Iran to build development projects. On the other side, Iranian officials and military officers traveled quietly to Israel for training. Israeli intelligence officers worked directly with their Iranian counterparts in Savak, Iran's notorious secret police, and Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, viewed Iran as a safe hub to monitor Soviet activity, Arab revolutions, and Islamist movements. It was a deep operational relationship, military to military, spy to spy. This wasn't a friendship in the emotional sense. It was a strategic deal, built on common threats. But that didn't make it any less real. Iran even allowed Israeli planes to use its airspace for certain missions and drills. Israeli diplomats, working out of their trade office in Tehran, maintained direct contact with high-level Iranian officials. There were even joint efforts to arm the Kurdish rebels in Iraq during the 1960s and early 70s. Both Iran and Israel saw the Kurds as a useful counterweight to Saddam Hussein's regime in Baghdad. The coordination ran across borders and continents. It reached into Africa, where both nations were vying for influence and trying to push back against Soviet-aligned states. It touched Europe, where Israeli and Iranian diplomats occasionally coordinated in Western capitals. The Shah's Iran was a silent partner in Israel's survival strategy, and while all of this was happening, the rest of the world turned a blind eye, or in some cases, quietly approved. The United States knew about the Iran-Israel relationship. Washington didn't talk about it, but they saw it as part of the broader Cold War picture. America wanted to contain Soviet influence. Israel and Iran, as pro-Western, anti-communist powers, were natural assets in that fight. The CIA had close ties with both governments, and American policymakers viewed their cooperation as beneficial. In fact, in the late 1970s, there were discussions in Washington about building a kind of regional security axis, Israel, Iran, and Turkey, as a triangle of stability in the Middle East. The relationship even extended to sensitive topics like nuclear technology. In the 1970s, Iran was beginning to explore nuclear energy with American help under the Atoms for Peace program. There's evidence that Israeli officials had indirect talks with the Shah's regime about nuclear cooperation. Nothing concrete ever came from it, and no weapons were developed together, but the channels were open. They weren't just thinking about the present, they were preparing for the future. Meanwhile, back in Iran, this whole arrangement was kept carefully hidden from the public. Most Iranians didn't know their government was cooperating with Israel. They had no idea that Israeli intelligence officers were walking the same halls as Savak interrogators, and they didn't know their oil was being shipped through secret pipelines to fuel the Israeli economy. The Shah's government never advertised it. It wasn't in the newspapers. It wasn't part of any public policy debate. It was a state secret, kept out of sight, out of mind. But not everyone was blind to it. Iran's religious scholars, particularly the ones critical of the Shah's westernization policies, were very aware of his ties to Israel, and they hated it. Among them was a man named Ruhollah Khomeini. In his sermons and writings, Khomeini accused the Shah of being a puppet of the West and a traitor to Islam. He pointed to Iran's relationship with Israel as one of the most shameful signs of the regime's betrayal of the Muslim world. For Khomeini and others in the Shia religious establishment, it wasn't just about politics, it was spiritual. To them, Israel represented Western colonization, anti-Islamic aggression, and the oppression of fellow Muslims in Palestine. Every deal the Shah made with Israel, every handshake behind closed doors, only strengthened the cleric's argument that Iran's monarchy had to go. But as far as the Shah was concerned, none of that mattered. He was focused on modernization, on making Iran into a 21st century superpower before the 20th century was even over. He hosted international summits, paraded his military strength, and spent billions on American weapons. Israel, to him, was just another piece of the puzzle, a useful partner, a strategic convenience. He wasn't interested in ideology. He was interested in security, economics, and staying ahead of the chaos that threatened to swallow the region. By the mid-1970s, the relationship between Iran and Israel was at its most active point. Israeli defense firms had offices in Tehran. Iranian pilots were training with Israeli advisors. Oil flowed. Weapons were exchanged. Intelligence was shared. There were rumors that Mossad even helped Savak build a file system on political dissidents. And Israeli leaders, particularly those in the security and foreign policy establishment, viewed Iran as one of the only stable, reliable partners they had in the Muslim world. They weren't allies in the formal sense, but in practice, they were on the same side of almost every major regional issue. And yet, for all its strength, this relationship existed in a kind of suspended illusion, an unspoken agreement that if no one asked, no one had to explain. Everything in Iran changed in a matter of months. It wasn't a gradual shift. It wasn't a quiet evolution. It was a political earthquake that shook the entire foundation of the country and buried everything that had existed between Iran and Israel. The partnership they had spent decades building disappeared overnight, not in some slow diplomatic breakdown, but in the roar of street protests, gunfire, and black flags. The Shah's Iran collapsed, and in its place rose something that didn't just oppose Israel. It hated everything it stood for. The signs had been building for years, even though most outside observers ignored them. Under the surface of Iran's modernization and westernization, something was bubbling. The Shah had tried to drag Iran into the modern age, but he had done it by crushing dissent, controlling the press, and empowering a secret police that tortured its critics. The religious leaders were pushed aside. The working class felt forgotten. The economy looked strong on the surface, but was unequal at its core. Corruption was everywhere. And the more the Shah leaned into luxury and foreign alliances, the more everyday Iranians felt like their country was slipping away from them. In the heart of this storm was a cleric who had been exiled years earlier, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From his exile in Iraq and later in France, Khomeini recorded speeches and sermons that were smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes. These tapes were passed hand to hand like sacred scrolls. They lit a fire. Khomeini wasn't just criticizing the Shah, he was calling for a complete overthrow of the system. He spoke of Western corruption, moral decay, and the betrayal of Islam. He condemned American influence, secular policies, and yes, Israel. To him, the Shah wasn't just a bad king, he was a traitor to the faith, and Israel was his co-conspirator. The revolution exploded in 1978. Millions of Iranians flooded the streets. Young and old, rich and poor, secular and religious, they marched with one message: the Shah had to go. By January 1979, the pressure was too much. The Shah fled Iran. He boarded a plane and never returned. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini returned to Tehran like a prophet returning from exile. He was greeted by crowds so massive that the airport road became a human river. Within weeks, the monarchy was gone. The Islamic Republic was born, and with it came the most radical change in Iranian foreign policy in the modern era. The first move wasn't economic or military, it was symbolic. Iran cut all diplomatic ties with Israel. But they didn't just close the Israeli mission in Tehran, they handed the building over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO flag was raised where the Israeli one had flown in secret. That wasn't diplomacy, that was a statement. The new Iranian government was telling the world that it saw Israel not just as a political enemy, but as an illegitimate regime. For the Islamic Republic, the issue wasn't about borders or territory, it was about ideology. Khomeini and his followers saw the world through a lens of resistance and purity. They believed Islam had been corrupted by Western influence, and they saw Israel as a colonial implant, a foreign project imposed by force on Muslim lands. They never used the word Israel. They called it the Zionist regime, not a country, not a people. A regime, an occupier, a cancer. That was the language of the new Iran. It didn't stop at words. Iran began organizing support for Palestinian groups. It funneled money and resources to factions that rejected peace with Israel. Tehran hosted Palestinian leaders, broadcast anti-Zionist speeches, and declared that the liberation of Jerusalem was a religious duty. Every Friday sermon ended with chants of "Death to Israel." School books were rewritten. Maps showed all of Israel as occupied Palestine. And while this might have seemed like theater to some in the West, in Iran, it was deadly serious. Hatred of Israel wasn't just a policy, it became part of the national identity. The speed of the reversal caught Israeli officials off guard. One day, they were speaking in coded language with Iranian generals, and the next day, they were watching those same generals flee for their lives. The Israeli diplomats were expelled. The trade deals vanished. Intelligence ties were severed. Israeli oil supplies, once secured through Iranian fields, dried up immediately. Israel had lost a strategic partner in the blink of an eye. What made it worse was that there was no replacement. The Islamic Republic wasn't interested in recalibrating the relationship. It wasn't seeking negotiation or compromise. It was believed that any connection with Israel was not just wrong, it was evil. And this belief wasn't confined to Khomeini himself. It was baked into the very DNA of the Islamic Republic. The Supreme Leader, the Revolutionary Guards, the ministries, all adopted the same position. Israel wasn't to be engaged. It was to be resisted by any means necessary. The new Iranian regime began building its regional identity around the concept of resistance. It positioned itself as the defender of oppressed Muslims everywhere, and it held up the Palestinian cause as its proof. Even though Iran is a Shia-majority country and most Palestinians are Sunni, the Islamic Republic made solidarity with Palestine a pillar of its foreign policy. It was less about sectarianism and more about anti-Zionism. It didn't matter if the Palestinians were religious or secular, Sunni or Shia. If they were against Israel, Iran would support them. That support began to show itself in practical ways. Iranian media ran documentaries about the Palestinian struggle. Tehran organized international conferences to unite anti-Israel forces, and Iranian money started flowing, quietly at first, toward militant groups in Lebanon and Gaza. But all of this was just getting started. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the main goal was to redefine Iran's identity, and that meant publicly rejecting everything the Shah had built, including his secret alliance with Israel. Inside Iran, the revolutionaries conducted purges. Former officials who had dealt with the Israelis were imprisoned or executed. Savak was dismantled. Pro-Western intellectuals fled, and anyone who had benefited from the old order suddenly found themselves hunted. Jewish Iranians, who had lived peacefully for generations, started to leave. Most were not targeted directly, but the atmosphere was dangerous. The new government made it clear that while Judaism as a religion might be tolerated, Zionism was not, and they made no distinction between Israeli policy and Jewish identity. At the international level, Iran's transformation sent shockwaves. Arab nations, many of whom had boycotted Israel for years, suddenly saw a new kind of player emerge, one that wasn't Arab, but more committed to the Palestinian cause than even they were. Iran started using its oil money not just to build itself up, but to fund resistance movements across the region. And in Israel, the shift was viewed as catastrophic. A once reliable partner had become the loudest voice calling for its destruction. This wasn't just diplomatic fallout. This was existential. Israeli intelligence reports from 1979 and 1980 show increasing concern about Iran's intentions. The idea that a revolutionary Islamic state, with access to oil wealth, military capability, and deep ideological conviction, had declared itself an enemy was seen as a game changer. The Israeli leadership realized that the problem wasn't going to be solved with sanctions or speeches. They were facing a country that no longer cared about compromise, recognition, or negotiation. The very existence of Israel was now a target. And the way Iran talked about Israel changed the conversation in the broader Muslim world. Khomeini's fiery sermons were translated into Arabic, Urdu, and other regional languages. His call to liberate Jerusalem from Zionist control echoed in mosques far beyond Iran. Iran positioned itself as the vanguard of Islamic resistance. It wasn't just challenging Israel, it was challenging the entire political order of the Middle East, including the moderate Arab regimes that had quietly begun to consider peace. Back in Tehran, the revolutionary regime began to celebrate events like Quds Day, an annual event calling for the liberation of Jerusalem and the end of the Israeli state. These events were massive, loud, and explicitly hostile. Children waved Palestinian flags. Billboards showed burning Israeli flags. Government officials gave speeches filled with anti-Zionist rhetoric. It became a ritual, a drumbeat, a constant reminder to the people of Iran that they were now at war, not a conventional war, but an ideological one. Inside Israel, this wasn't just a regional concern. It was a warning sign of something bigger. The idea that a country could undergo such a rapid transformation from partner to enemy frightened Israeli officials. They had underestimated the power of ideology, the depth of the revolution, and the permanence of the break. And while Israel had faced hostile neighbors before, Iran was different. It wasn't an Arab country. It didn't share borders, but it had money, ambition, and a long memory. The fallout reached every part of the former relationship. The oil deals were canceled. The intelligence networks were dismantled. The defense contracts were voided. Israeli businesses that had operated quietly in Iran were forced out, their assets seized. Families with dual ties, Jews in Tehran with relatives in Tel Aviv, suddenly found themselves cut off. It wasn't just politics. It was a rupture. A line had been drawn, and there was no walking it back. Iran's message to Israel was clear and absolute. We do not recognize you, we do not accept you, and we will not deal with you under any circumstances. And that message wasn't hidden behind polite diplomatic language. It was loud, it was raw, and it was just getting started. By the early years of the 1980s, Israel and Iran were no longer pretending to play the same game. They had burned the bridge completely, but instead of facing off on a battlefield, they found a far more dangerous way to fight, through other people. This is where things got complicated, because the two countries never launched a direct war against each other. No columns of tanks, no mass mobilization. What they did instead was arm, train, fund, and guide others to fight their enemy for them. They didn't need to meet in person. They met in Beirut, in Gaza, in Damascus, in refugee camps and border zones. And what began here would go on to reshape the Middle East. The 1980s opened with blood. Iran, fresh from its revolution, was immediately plunged into one of the most brutal wars in modern history. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from the year 1980 to the year 1988. Saddam Hussein saw the chaos inside Iran and thought it was the perfect time to strike. Iraq invaded. What followed was a disaster of trench warfare, chemical weapons, and nearly 1 million lives lost. It was one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century, and Iran, desperate and surrounded, doubled down on its belief that it was being attacked not just by Iraq, but by a Western-backed world order. Israel wasn't even a combatant in the war, but inside Tehran's revolutionary logic, Israel was part of the same system that had supported the Shah, armed Iraq in the past, and stood with the United States. So even as Iranian soldiers were dying by the thousands against Iraqi forces, Tehran's leadership never lost focus on Israel. The enemy, in their eyes, had multiple faces. Israel, on the other hand, saw Saddam Hussein as a threat too. He was loud, ambitious, and armed to the teeth. In fact, in the early 1980s, Israel made a controversial decision to bomb Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor before it became operational. It was a risky move, but Israel was determined not to allow any hostile state in the region to obtain nuclear weapons. Even though Israel had no sympathy for Iran's revolution, there were Israeli analysts who quietly admitted that a weakened Iraq, stuck in a war with Iran, was not necessarily a bad thing. But any illusion that Israel and Iran might still find common ground in hating Saddam was shattered quickly. Because as Iran fought Iraq on one front, it opened another in the shadows, against Israel. The battlefield was Lebanon. In the year 1982, Israel launched a full-scale invasion of southern Lebanon. The goal was to push out the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been launching attacks into northern Israel from Lebanese territory. Israeli tanks rolled north. Planes bombed PLO positions. Beirut came under siege. It was brutal. The images of the destruction were broadcast across the Arab and Muslim world, including inside Iran. But while the rest of the region watched in horror, Tehran saw an opportunity. Iran had already begun exporting its revolution beyond its borders. It wasn't just a country anymore. It saw itself as the beating heart of a pan-Islamic resistance. So when Israel invaded Lebanon, Iran sent its own elite units, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, to the BKA Valley in eastern Lebanon. Officially, they were there to train and advise. Unofficially, they were laying the foundation for something permanent. What Iran helped create in Lebanon was more than just a militia. It was a movement. It was called Hezbollah, which means Party of God. This was not just another rebel group. This was a full-blown military political organization, rooted in Shia Islam, loyal to Iran's supreme leader, and dedicated to the elimination of Israel. The first public messages from Hezbollah weren't subtle. Their founding charter called for the destruction of the Israeli state, the removal of Western influence from the Muslim world, and the establishment of Islamic rule. They saw Israel not as a neighbor, but as an invader. And with Iranian training, weapons, and ideology, they began launching attacks. Hezbollah didn't start with rockets. They started with guerrilla warfare, ambushes, bombings, kidnappings. In the year 1983, suicide bombers drove trucks full of explosives into the United States Marine barracks in Beirut, killing over 200 American servicemen. Another blast targeted the French military compound. Western intelligence agencies quickly linked the attack to Hezbollah, and through Hezbollah, to Iran. This wasn't just a local resistance. This was the export of a state-backed insurgency. From Israel's perspective, it was a nightmare. They had gone into Lebanon to clear out one enemy and had accidentally given rise to another one, far more fanatical and backed by an actual government. Over the next few years, Hezbollah escalated. They began attacking Israeli outposts in southern Lebanon, planting roadside bombs, and launching cross-border raids. They kidnapped Israeli soldiers and, in some cases, executed them or held them for ransom. And every time Israel struck back, Hezbollah grew stronger. They framed every Israeli airstrike as evidence of their righteous struggle. The more destruction, the more support. Iran wasn't just sending money. It was sending advisors, technology, and ideological instruction. Hezbollah's political wing mirrored Iran's model. Its religious leaders quoted Khomeini. its fighters trained with Iranian instructors. Its military units used tactics directly modeled after the IRGC. And as the years passed, Hezbollah transformed into a force that didn't just fight Israel. It adapted, survived, and became central to Iran's regional strategy. At the same time, Iran was building connections elsewhere. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Israel was facing a new uprising in the Palestinian territories. It was called the First Intifada, an explosion of street protests, rock throwing, and civil disobedience that erupted in the year 1987. Most of the world focused on the Israeli military and the Palestinian civilians clashing in the streets. But in the background, Iran was reaching in. Tehran began looking for Palestinian groups that rejected negotiation with Israel, groups that wanted armed struggle, groups that wouldn't talk peace. That's when Iran began building ties with Hamas. At the time, Hamas was a young offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were Sunni, not Shia, and for most governments, that would have been a deal breaker. But Iran didn't care. They didn't need perfect ideological alignment. They needed shared enemies. Hamas rejected Israel's right to exist. That was enough. Iran began sending funds, offering training, and using its allies in Syria and Lebanon to build a support network for Hamas leadership. Over time, Hamas developed its own military wing, called the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades. They began launching attacks on Israeli targets, especially in the Gaza Strip. They sent suicide bombers into Israeli cities. They built tunnels under the border. And behind the scenes, Iranian advisors were teaching them how to make their weapons deadlier, how to smuggle equipment, how to evade Israeli surveillance. Even when Palestinian politics fractured, when Hamas fought Fatah and took full control of Gaza in the year 2007, Iran stuck with them. Tehran didn't need Hamas to be popular. It just needed them to keep the fire burning. Meanwhile, Israel was evolving too. The Israeli military was investing in advanced surveillance, air power, and special forces. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, ramped up its operations across the region. They tracked Hezbollah movements in Lebanon. They built intelligence networks inside Syria. They monitored Hamas operatives in Gaza and beyond, and they began identifying Iran as the central engine behind all of it. Publicly, Israeli leaders started to shift their language. They stopped treating Hezbollah or Hamas as isolated threats. They began naming Iran as the head of the snake. But Israel wasn't just watching, it was also acting. In some cases, it supported Lebanese Christian militias fighting Hezbollah. In others, it launched airstrikes on suspected weapons convoys. And in one of the most controversial moments of the 1980s, Israel played a strange role in the Iran-Contra affair. While Iran and Israel were enemies in public, some elements in the Israeli security establishment participated in a secret plan to sell arms to Iran during its war with Iraq. The idea was to gain influence and perhaps moderate some of Iran's worst tendencies. But the plan backfired. It became a scandal, exposed to the world, and if anything, it only deepened Iran's distrust of the West. By the time the 1990s rolled in, the shadow war was fully underway. Iran had built a system, Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south. Other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad received support too, and through Syria, a loyal ally to Tehran, Iran moved weapons, money, and advisors all across the region. From Israeli intelligence files to Arab League meetings, everyone began acknowledging the same thing. Iran was no longer just exporting ideas. It was exporting war, and yet none of this was official. Iran and Israel never declared war. They didn't engage on the battlefield with flags and tanks, but their fingerprints were on every crisis, every rocket from Hezbollah, every bombing in Tel Aviv, every raid on Gaza, every assassination in Beirut. It all connected back to the same invisible hands. This wasn't just geopolitics anymore. This was a new kind of warfare. Proxy warfare, silent, deadly, and nearly impossible to stop. What made it more dangerous was that it wasn't just about politics. It had become personal. Iranian leaders gave speeches calling for the destruction of Israel. Israeli leaders warned that Iran was the source of all terror against them. School children on both sides were growing up learning that the other side wanted them dead, and the proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others, were no longer just tools. They had become independent actors with their own momentum, their own goals, but still tied to the bigger fight. This was the new landscape, a war that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, a war without front lines, a war fought through microphones, missiles, and martyrdom. And as the 1990s pushed forward, the pieces on the board were locked in place. Iran had its network, Israel had its defenses, and neither side was backing down. There's a strange chapter in this history, one so ironic that it almost feels made up. After everything that had happened between Iran and Israel by the mid-1980s, after the revolution, after the embassy handover to the PLO, after the fiery sermons and the chants of death to Israel, something happened that didn't fit the script. Weapons moved from Israel to Iran. That's not a metaphor. It's a historical fact. Real guns, real missiles, paid for, delivered, and used. But it didn't happen through diplomacy. It happened in the shadows, through one of the most controversial and secretive operations in modern political history. An affair so twisted that it linked Ayatollahs to Mossad, the Pentagon to arms dealers, and Israel to the very state that had sworn to destroy it. This was the Iran-Contra affair, and it broke all the rules. To understand how this even became possible, you have to look at the broader chaos of the 1980s. Iran was still locked in a brutal war with Iraq. The fighting had gone on for years, and the casualties were staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead on both sides. Iran was running low on weapons, ammunition, and advanced spare parts. The United States and its allies had placed strict arms embargoes on Iran following the revolution and the hostage crisis, when 52 Americans were held for 444 days in Tehran. That incident had poisoned everything. But war has a way of bending reality, and Iran needed weapons badly, especially spare parts for the American-made systems it had inherited from the Shah's era. Fighter jets, missile launchers, radar equipment, it was all U.S. built, and no one else could service it. Israel, meanwhile, was watching the region shift rapidly. Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which had once been quietly seen as a useful counter to revolutionary Iran, was now being flooded with Soviet and French arms. Israel feared that if Iraq won the war, it would emerge stronger, bolder, and more aggressive toward Israel. In private, Israeli defense officials admitted that a weakened Iran, even under a hostile regime, might be better than a triumphant Iraq with a rebuilt army. It wasn't about liking Iran, it was about managing the threat balance. Israel didn't want either side to win. It wanted both stuck, struggling, bleeding each other into stalemate. Somewhere in that strategic calculus, a plan was born. The idea was simple, at least on paper. Israel would send some of its own US-made weapons to Iran, missiles, spare parts, basic gear, and in return, Iran would help secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah. This wasn't some rogue operation. It was run through back channels and greenlit at high levels. Israeli officials believed that by helping broker the deal, they could gain leverage with Tehran, test the waters for future influence, and at the very least, control where the weapons were going. But this wasn't just a two-way deal. The United States was involved too, secretly but deeply. The Reagan administration had a growing problem in Latin America. It wanted to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, known as the Contras. Congress had passed a law forbidding any official U.S. funding of those rebels, so some members of the U.S. government began looking for off-the-books funding sources. That's when two streams of American foreign policy, one in the Middle East, one in Central America, crashed into each other. The operation worked like this. Israel would ship weapons to Iran. Iran would pay for them. The money from those sales would then be secretly funneled to the Contras in Nicaragua. In theory, hostages in Lebanon would be released as a show of goodwill, and the U.S. could maintain plausible deniability. But none of this was legal, none of it was authorized by Congress, and most of it violated official U.S. policy, which labeled Iran a terrorist-supporting state. Still, the first shipment went through in 1985. The Iranians received surface-to-air missiles. The payment was wired. Shortly after, one American hostage was released in Lebanon. Encouraged, the plan continued. More shipments followed, and then more. Over time, Israel delivered hundreds of tons of weapons to Iran, many of them transferred through third-party countries, with falsified documentation. The deals were kept out of public view, managed by a web of intermediaries, arms dealers, intelligence officers, and covert operatives. But for all the secrecy, the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. The whole thing exploded in late 1986 when a Lebanese magazine leaked details of the operation. The American press picked it up quickly. Congressional investigators launched hearings. What followed was a political firestorm. In the United States, the scandal rocked the Reagan administration. It was revealed that senior officials had knowingly violated the law. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a key figure in the National Security Council, became the public face of the operation. He admitted to shredding documents, misleading Congress, and funneling cash without authorization. In Israel, the reaction was more muted. The Israeli government defended its role by saying it had acted in line with U.S. interests. But behind closed doors, the operation had caused internal division. Some in Israel's military and intelligence community believed the whole thing had been a mistake. Iran hadn't softened, it hadn't reduced its anti-Israel rhetoric, and the weapons sent might one day be used against Israel's allies. Iran's leadership, for its part, never admitted the full extent of the deal. They played both sides. In public, they condemned Israel and the United States with their usual fury. In private, they counted the crates of weapons and signed the bank transfers. It was pure hypocrisy, but in Tehran's eyes, that wasn't a contradiction. They viewed war as a field of strategy, not purity. They needed weapons, and if they could get them from the very people they denounced, so be it, as long as it served the revolution. And yet, something deeper was happening here. Even though the Iran-Contra affair was a temporary arrangement, it revealed something profound about the new order in the Middle East. Enemies weren't always who they claimed to be. Alliances could be built, broken, and rebuilt in secret. Public hostility didn't always reflect private behavior. And when power was on the table, even the fiercest rhetoric could bend to convenience. For Israel, the operation was proof that influence still mattered. Even in a post-revolution Iran, there were ways to play the game. But the optimism didn't last. Iran took the weapons, released a few hostages, and then went right back to business, supporting Hezbollah, denouncing Israel, and building its resistance network across the region. The moment passed. The window closed. Whatever leverage Israel thought it might gain evaporated quickly. The Iran-Contra scandal also had another consequence. It exposed the fragility of international norms. The idea that states could be held accountable to law, to policy, to principle was shattered. Everyone had broken their own rules. The United States had violated its laws. Israel had armed a sworn enemy. Iran had negotiated with the same actors it publicly called devils, and all of it had happened in secret until it didn't. Even after the scandal was exposed, no one faced major punishment. Oliver North became a folk hero to some in the U.S. He was convicted but later had his convictions overturned. President Reagan claimed he couldn't recall key details. In Israel, the officials involved returned to their normal posts, and in Iran, the leadership never explained what had happened. The silence was total, but for historians, intelligence officers, and policymakers, the message was clear. In the Middle East, things were not what they seemed. A country might denounce you in the morning and call you in the evening. Deals were always possible. Betrayals were always lurking. And the game was always being played 3 layers deep. The Iran-Contra affair wasn't just a scandal. It was a mirror. It showed the world what desperation, ambition, and secrecy could do when they collided. It showed that even the deepest rivalries had cracks. And it showed that in the Middle East, no door was ever fully closed, not even between countries that claim to be mortal enemies. Some conflicts are fought with guns, some with words, but others unfold in the silence of laboratories, behind heavy concrete doors, in the hum of uranium centrifuges. This is where the Iran-Israel story took on a new and terrifying dimension, one that had nothing to do with border skirmishes or missile launches. This was about the bomb, not just the idea of it, but the very real, very calculated steps to building one. And for Israel, that wasn't just a strategic threat, it was an existential one. Iran's interest in nuclear technology began long before its revolution. Back in the 1970s, under the Shah, Iran had been a close partner with the United States and several European countries on nuclear development. At the time, it was all framed as peaceful. Iran needed energy. Oil wouldn't last forever. So the Shah began building the foundation for nuclear energy, reactors, research centers, and contracts with foreign firms. There were whispers even then that the Shah's ambitions might stretch further, but no one pushed too hard. He was an ally. And back then, the world didn't see nuclear energy as such a dangerous gift. When the Islamic Revolution happened in the year 1979, everything paused. Nuclear projects were shut down. Foreign companies pulled out. The new regime under Ayatollah Khomeini viewed the nuclear program with suspicion. It was a symbol of Western arrogance, and for a time, it was neglected. But war changes priorities. During the 8 long years of bloodshed with Iraq, Iran realized that it needed to rethink everything. Saddam Hussein's regime had used chemical weapons against Iranian troops. Iraqi ambitions were brutal and unrestrained, and while Iraq had once flirted with building a bomb of its own, Israel had already destroyed that threat with its airstrike on the Osirak reactor in the year 1981. Iran took notes. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Iran began quietly reviving its nuclear program. This time, it wasn't just about electricity, it was about insurance. The regime had learned that international isolation, war, and sanctions could come at any moment, and the only way to guarantee long-term survival was to develop something that made invasion unthinkable. In their view, that was a nuclear deterrent. But Iran didn't build its program in the open. It did it under layers of secrecy, scattered across multiple facilities, buried beneath concrete and bureaucracy. For years, the international community had no idea what was happening. Iran said all the right things in public. They signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They told the world their program was peaceful. They invited inspectors to certain sites. But behind the curtain, other things were happening. Israel, of course, was watching closely. They had the intelligence. Mossad tracked Iranian scientists, intercepted communications, followed procurement chains across Europe and Asia. What they saw alarmed them. Iran was buying parts that had nothing to do with civilian reactors. Things like dual-use centrifuge components, specialized metals, and military-grade designs. But the real bombshell came in the year 2002. That year, an Iranian dissident group leaked the location of 2 secret nuclear sites, Natanz and Arak. These weren't power plants. Natanz was a massive underground uranium enrichment facility. Arak was being developed for heavy water production, which could be used in plutonium-based weapons. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, was forced to investigate. And when they did, the cover story fell apart. Iran had been hiding critical elements of its nuclear infrastructure for years. The world took notice. The IAEA demanded more access. Iran agreed, reluctantly. They said the concealment was due to fear of sabotage. But the excuse didn't hold up. Enrichment was the key issue. Uranium enrichment is a process that can be used for both energy and weapons, depending on how far it's taken. Low enriched uranium is used for power. Highly enriched uranium, 90% or more, is used for bombs. Iran claimed it only wanted fuel for reactors, but as the inspections deepened, the timeline of Iran's nuclear progress started moving faster. By the year 2005, Iran resumed enrichment at Natanz, and the confrontation began to escalate. The newly elected president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, took a hardline stance. He was fiery, nationalist, and completely unashamed of confronting the West. He dismissed criticism. He rejected compromise. He even hosted a Holocaust denial conference in Tehran and said Israel should be wiped off the map. The rhetoric was disturbing, but it was what was happening underground that truly terrified Israeli officials. Natanz grew rapidly. Thousands of centrifuges were installed. Iran began testing advanced models, and even though it insisted the enrichment was staying under 20%, a level below weapons grade, the fear was always that with enough time and know-how, that line could be crossed in weeks, not years. Israel responded in its way. Publicly, it condemned Iran at every international forum. Prime ministers issued warnings. Intelligence officials gave private briefings to European and American allies. But behind the scenes, Israel was preparing for the worst. They developed strike plans for Iranian nuclear sites. They purchased long-range aircraft, bunker-busting bombs, and built new refueling capabilities. At the same time, they launched a different kind of war, one no one had seen before. Around the year 2009, a mysterious computer virus appeared. It was called Stuxnet. It wasn't just any virus. It was a sophisticated cyber weapon designed to infiltrate industrial control systems, specifically the ones used at Natanz. The virus caused the centrifuges to spin out of control, damaging the machinery without triggering alarms. It was like poisoning someone slowly, without them realizing it. The virus set Iran's program back by months, possibly years, and while no country officially took credit, all signs pointed to a joint Israeli-American operation. For Iran, the message was clear. Their enemies weren't just watching, they were inside the system. After Stuxnet, a wave of cyber attacks and assassinations followed. Iranian nuclear scientists began dying, shot in the streets, blown up by car bombs, killed in mysterious explosions. In at least 5 known cases, key figures in Iran's nuclear program were assassinated between the years 2010 and 2012. The weapons were precise. The timing was surgical. The message was unmistakable. Iran blamed Israel for every incident. Israeli officials said nothing, smiled thinly, and moved on. It was never confirmed officially, but everyone knew the truth. Mossad had gone deep into Iran, not with planes or missiles, but with agents and wires, and they were hitting the program from the inside. For Iran, it was humiliation. For Israel, it was a strategy. Stop the bomb at any cost. But this war in the shadows couldn't last forever. Iran kept rebuilding. For every setback, they found a workaround. Centrifuges were replaced, scientists were protected, and the program inched forward. International pressure mounted. The United Nations imposed sanctions. The European Union banned oil imports. The United States froze billions in Iranian assets. But none of it stopped the enrichment. And still, Iran never admitted to building a weapon. Their official stance remained the same. This was for energy, for research, for sovereignty. But the trust was gone. The nuclear file became the most sensitive issue in the Middle East, and for Israel, it became a red line, clear, immovable, and final. No nuclear Iran, ever. This wasn't about conventional war anymore. It wasn't about Hezbollah rockets or Hamas tunnels. This was about survival. Israeli leaders believed that a nuclear-armed Iran would mean the end of deterrence. Iran could pass nuclear materials to proxies, that it could strike Israel and hide behind the shield of the bomb. It wasn't paranoia. It was doctrine. Inside Israeli war rooms, the maps of Natanz and Fordo were studied daily. Bunker depths were measured. Missile ranges were calculated. The question wasn't if, but when. And the world knew it. Diplomats scrambled to find a way to slow things down, to stop the countdown. But the enrichment continued. The centrifuges spun. And in that quiet hum of nuclear ambition, the shadow of something darker began to grow. When countries stop talking and start watching each other, intelligence takes center stage. And when those countries already see each other as existential enemies, the espionage never sleeps. That's exactly what happened between Israel and Iran. Long before missiles ever left their silos, before warplanes ever crossed the sky, the fight had already begun in the shadows. The battleground was not a single place. It stretched across hotel rooms in Istanbul, alleyways in Beirut, safe houses in Europe, and labs deep inside Iran. On one side was Mossad, Israel's elite intelligence service, small, ruthless, highly trained. On the other hand was Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its Foreign Operations Unit, the Quds Force, a powerful branch with a deep reach and a long memory. The two locked into a secret war that spanned decades. There were no uniforms, no flags, no declarations. Just operations, one after another, carried out in silence until the bodies dropped or the data vanished. Mossad had a clear priority: stop Iran from ever developing a nuclear weapon, and stop it from arming and controlling the region through proxies. The IRGC's Quds Force, on the other hand, was focused on expanding Iranian influence and destabilizing what it saw as an Israeli-American regional system of control. These missions clashed constantly, not just in Iran or Israel, but in countries far beyond their borders. Every embassy was a potential base, every scientist a target, every defector a risk. This wasn't just about information, it was about eliminating threats before they even took form. By the early 2000s, Mossad had already begun hunting Iran's nuclear scientists. These weren't random names, they were chosen carefully. People directly tied to uranium enrichment, warhead design, and delivery systems. The first attacks came quietly. A car exploded here. A motorbike assassin is there. The most high-profile operation happened in Tehran itself. Between the year 2010 and the years 2012, at least 5 Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in highly sophisticated operations. One was blown up when a bomb was magnetically attached to his car by a motorcyclist in morning traffic. Another was shot at point-blank range while heading to work. Another died in a controlled explosion in his laboratory. Each time, Iran accused Mossad. Israel never said a word, but the pattern was obvious. The killings were precise, surgical, and timed to send a message. If you work on the bomb, we will find you. These hits weren't just about slowing Iran down. They were about disrupting its confidence. Iranian scientists began traveling with security convoys. Some refused to work on sensitive programs. The fear was real. Inside Iranian intelligence circles, there was confusion and paranoia. How did Mossad get in? Who helped them? Were there traitors among them? Tehran launched internal purges. Dozens were arrested. Some were executed. But Mossad's reach kept extending. It wasn't just assassinations. Israel was inside Iranian systems, literally. After the Stuxnet virus damaged the centrifuges at Natanz, Iran ramped up cybersecurity like never before. But it wasn't enough. More malware followed. Duke, Flame. Other programs are designed to map Iranian networks, exfiltrate data, and locate vulnerabilities. These cyber weapons were not built in someone's basement. They were state-grade, written by elite coders with unlimited resources. Iran, for all its denials, knew it had been hit hard, and it knew who was behind it. But Iran wasn't passive. The Quds Force had its network of assets, and its reach went far beyond the Middle East. Iranian operatives began stalking Israeli diplomats overseas. In the year 2012, a bomb exploded in New Delhi, injuring the Israeli ambassador's wife. The same week, attacks were attempted in Georgia and Thailand. They were poorly executed, but the intention was clear. Iran was sending a warning: if you touch our people, we'll touch yours. Hezbollah, Iran's most loyal proxy, became one of its main tools in this intelligence war. Hezbollah operatives ran surveillance on Israeli tourists, synagogues, and embassies around the world. In the year 2012, a suicide bomber targeted an Israeli tour bus in Burgas, Bulgaria, killing 5 Israeli tourists and their Bulgarian driver. Israeli intelligence traced the operation back to Hezbollah, and behind Hezbollah, directly to the IRGC. It wasn't just about revenge. It was a reminder that Iran's tentacles could reach anywhere. The same year, Mossad pulled off one of its boldest moves yet. Deep in Tehran, in the heart of the capital, Israeli agents broke into a warehouse where Iran had stored its nuclear archive, a vault of blueprints, documents, and disks dating back decades. Mossad agents weren't just observing. They took the files, physically. Over 50,000 pages and 163 disks of data were smuggled out of Iran and into Israel in one night. It was the kind of operation you'd expect to see in a movie, but it was real. When Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu revealed the documents to the world in the year 2018, he stood in front of them like a prosecutor at trial. The message was loud and clear: Iran lied. It had preserved its nuclear weapons knowledge, kept it hidden, and planned to reactivate it if the opportunity came. Iran dismissed the presentation as a stunt, but international analysts studied the archive and confirmed the documents were authentic. Inside Iran, that heist was a humiliation. Security officials were furious. Investigations were launched. Dozens of intelligence personnel were reassigned. But the embarrassment ran deeper. If Mossad could get that far into Tehran, what else could it do? Assassinations continued. In late November of the year 2020, Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was killed just outside Tehran. The operation was unlike anything seen before. According to Iranian sources, it involved a remote-controlled machine gun mounted on a pickup truck, satellite-linked, and operated without a single agent on site. Fakhrizadeh was shot multiple times. His wife survived. The car was riddled with bullets. Iran blamed Israel immediately. Israel again stayed silent. But the entire world understood what had just happened. The architect of Iran's nuclear program had been eliminated, not by an airstrike or drone, but by a machine that could kill and vanish. This wasn't just technological warfare. It was psychological. Iranian scientists and officials began looking over their shoulders everywhere they went. They avoided patterns. They changed routines. And still, they kept getting hit. Inside Israeli intelligence, these were high-stakes missions. The risk of failure was enormous, but the cost of doing nothing, in their view, was even higher. They were trying to buy time, delay the bomb, rattle the system. Iran responded with its campaigns. Cyber attacks against Israeli companies spiked. Water treatment plants were hit with attempted hacks. Medical systems were targeted. Some attacks succeeded. Others were blocked. But Iran was adapting. Its cyber units grew. It launched social media manipulation campaigns, ran disinformation operations, and used proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah to test new tools in real-world conflicts. The battlefield kept expanding. In Africa, Iranian cells were caught plotting attacks on Israeli and Jewish targets in Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. In Europe, Mossad disrupted planned assassinations. In the Gulf, Iranian agents tracked Israeli-linked shipping. Every continent had become part of the map, and the line between spycraft and sabotage grew thinner by the year. But even in this dark war, some moments revealed just how deep the conflict had gone. In early 2021, a massive explosion hit Iran's Natanz nuclear facility once again. This time it wasn't a virus. It was physical sabotage. Power was cut. Equipment destroyed. Iran accused Israel of planting explosives inside the site months earlier. How did they get in? No one knows for sure. But the pattern was now unmistakable. Every time Iran moved forward, Israel found a way to push back. Not through invasion, not through treaties, but through operatives, software, sabotage, and steel nerves. The intelligence war between Mossad and the IRGC wasn't about winning in the traditional sense. It was about disruption, disorientation, denial. And for both sides, it was personal. Mossad operated under the belief that stopping a nuclear Iran was a moral obligation. The IRGC operated under the belief that resisting Zionist influence was a divine mission. Each saw themselves as defenders. Each believed the other was a liar and a killer. The casualties weren't just intelligence officers. They were scientists, engineers, dissidents, businessmen, and sometimes bystanders. People who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's the price of shadow wars. They don't happen in secret labs. They bleed into the streets. And yet, for all the blows traded, the war kept going. Neither side backed down. Neither blinked. Because in the world of intelligence, there are no ceasefires, only windows of opportunity. And in the space between silence and explosion, that war never really stops. By the early 2010s, the Iranian nuclear issue had turned into the world's most high-stakes diplomatic puzzle. The centrifuges were still spinning, the threats still echoing, and the assassinations still making headlines. But even as shadow wars continued behind the curtain, something else was happening in the open. Diplomacy, which had been frozen for decades, started to thaw. After years of failed talks, missed chances, and bitter stalemates, Iran and the world's major powers finally came to the same table. What followed was one of the most ambitious and controversial diplomatic efforts in recent memory, a deal that would be praised as visionary, condemned as naive, and eventually torn to pieces by the stroke of a pen. The roots of the nuclear negotiations go back to a growing sense of urgency. Iran was under immense pressure. Years of sanctions had strangled its economy. Oil exports were down. Its banking system was isolated. Inflation was out of control. The people were feeling it, and while the regime blamed the West, it also understood that something had to change. At the same time, there was a shift in leadership. In the year 2013, Iran elected a new president, Hassan Rouhani. He was a cleric, but not a firebrand. He ran on a platform of engagement and reform. He wasn't soft, but he wasn't Mahmoud Ahmadinejad either. His message was clear. Iran would not abandon its right to nuclear technology, but it was ready to negotiate limits in exchange for relief. The talks that followed were intense. They involved Iran and the P5+1, 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany. On the surface, it was about enrichment levels, breakout time, inspections. But underneath it all, it was about trust. Decades of lies, spying, hostility, and war stood between them. Progress was slow. There were walkouts, accusations, leaks. But step by step, inch by inch, the framework began to take shape. Then, in July of the year 2015, the deal was signed. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. The core of the agreement was this: Iran would drastically reduce its nuclear program. It would get rid of over 90% of its enriched uranium stockpile, dismantle 2/3 of its centrifuges, and redesign its heavy water reactor in Iraq. It would also allow strict, round-the-clock inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In return, the United States and its allies would lift economic sanctions. Billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets would be released. Iran would be allowed back into global oil markets. The idea was to cap Iran's nuclear ambitions and give the world at least a year's warning if Iran ever tried to break out and build a bomb. Supporters of the deal called it a triumph of diplomacy over war. They argued that perfect was never possible, and this was the best way to stop Iran from reaching the threshold. Critics, especially in Israel and parts of the Gulf, called it a dangerous gamble. They said it didn't dismantle Iran's program, it just paused it, and it ignored everything else. Iran's missile development, its support for terror groups, its regional meddling. No one criticized the deal louder or longer than Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. For him, the JCPOA wasn't just flawed, it was catastrophic. In speech after speech, he described Iran as a regime that could never be trusted. He said the deal paved Iran's path to a bomb. He went beyond backdoor diplomacy. In March of the year 2015, he stood before the United States Congress and delivered a dramatic speech opposing the agreement. It was a bold and controversial move. He did it without informing the White House, and it sparked a political firestorm. But Netanyahu didn't care. His message was blunt. This deal is a mistake, and history will judge those who let it happen. Inside Israel, opinion was divided. The security establishment, including some former Mossad chiefs, said the deal, while imperfect, at least gave breathing room. But Netanyahu saw it differently. He believed Iran would bide its time, obey the terms just long enough to reap the economic benefits, and then sprint toward the bomb once restrictions expired. He feared that the deal's sunset clauses, terms that would phase out after 10 or 15 years, meant that Iran could become a nuclear threshold state with international legitimacy, and he feared that lifting sanctions would flood Tehran with resources it could then use to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and other hostile forces. Still, the deal went forward. Iran complied. The IAEA issued report after report confirming that Iran was meeting its obligations. Enrichment levels dropped. Fordow was converted into a research center. Natanz was monitored closely. The mood in Washington was cautious but hopeful. The Obama administration had staked much of its foreign policy legacy on the deal. European leaders praised it. Diplomats said it was proof that even bitter enemies could find common ground. But the calm didn't last. In January of the year 2017, Donald Trump became President of the United States. From day one, he had called the JCPOA the worst deal ever negotiated. His foreign policy team included longtime Iran hawks. They believed Iran was cheating, or at least exploiting the loopholes. They pointed to Iran's missile tests, its continued support for militias in Iraq and Syria, and its defiant rhetoric. Trump wanted out. In May of the year 2018, he announced it officially. The United States would withdraw from the nuclear deal. Sanctions would be reimposed. Any company that did business with Iran would be cut off from the American financial system. It was a full reversal. The deal wasn't just abandoned, it was shredded. And Iran, understandably, was furious. They said they had kept their word, that the United States had broken trust. European allies tried to keep the deal alive, but without the United States, the foundation cracked. European companies, fearing penalties, pulled out. Iranian oil exports plummeted again, and the hope of a reset vanished. Inside Iran, the hardliners took the upper hand. They mocked the moderates who had promised that diplomacy would work. They said, "We told you, America can't be trusted." And step by step, Iran began walking away from the deal's limits. Enrichment levels increased. Stockpiles grew. New centrifuges were installed. Inspections were restricted. The very thing the deal had tried to prevent was now happening in real time. Israel, for its part, doubled down on its campaign. In April of the year 2018, just weeks before Trump pulled out, Netanyahu held a primetime press conference where he revealed that Mossad had smuggled Iran's secret nuclear archive out of Tehran. He stood next to slides and diagrams and declared, "Iran lied." The world already knew Iran had a weapons program before the deal, but Netanyahu's dramatic reveal gave political ammunition to those pushing for withdrawal. He made the case that Iran could not be trusted, not now, not ever. The aftermath of the collapse was chaotic. Iran's economy plunged. Protests erupted inside the country. The Trump administration launched what it called a maximum pressure campaign. Sanctions were expanded. Oil exports fell to historic lows. But Iran didn't fold. It didn't come back to the table. Instead, it dug in deeper. The Revolutionary Guards became more powerful. Iran turned to China and Russia for support, and in the shadows, enrichment continued. By the end of the Trump presidency, Iran's uranium enrichment had reached 20% purity again. That number didn't mean it had a bomb, but it meant the breakout time, the time needed to produce enough fissile material for one weapon, had shrunk. The window was closing. Diplomats warned of a crisis. Military planners drew up scenarios. But the truth was undeniable. The deal that once offered time and transparency was gone, and what remained was a fragile, unstable balance, one that could collapse at any moment. When Syria erupted in 2011, the world watched with horror. What started as a few protests in Damascus and Dara quickly spiraled into one of the bloodiest civil wars of the 21st century. But to Israel and Iran, Syria was never just Syria. It wasn't just about Assad or the rebels or ISIS. It was geography. It was proximity. It was an opportunity and a threat. For Iran, the Syrian war was a chance to build something it had always wanted, a direct military corridor from Tehran to the Mediterranean. For Israel, it was the nightmare of Iranian soldiers and rockets setting up camp just across its northern border. Neither country declared war in Syria. Neither acknowledged the scale of their involvement. But beneath the chaos of the civil war, a shadow war bloomed. Iran didn't wait long. As soon as Assad's regime began to teeter, Tehran acted. The Syrian president had been a longtime ally, and his fall would have meant a devastating blow to Iran's regional axis. So the Quds Force, the foreign operations wing of the Revolutionary Guards, stepped in. At first, it was advisors, weapons, intelligence. Then came militias, fighters from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Lebanon. Iran didn't just want to save Assad, it wanted to own the battlefield. By 2013, Hezbollah fighters were openly deployed in Syria, taking heavy losses to defend regime strongholds. Iran was spending billions, flying in weapons, building bases, constructing intelligence facilities. It wasn't a temporary move, it was a permanent footprint. For Israel, the alarm bells rang immediately. Syria and Israel had never made peace, but under Assad, the border had remained relatively quiet for decades. That quiet was about to end. The idea of Hezbollah gaining combat experience in Syria, stockpiling precision weapons, and turning southern Syria into a launching pad for future wars was intolerable to Israeli defense planners. But Israel didn't rush in with ground troops. It chose a different strategy. Airstrikes, silent, precise, denied publicly but obvious to anyone paying attention. The first major Israeli strike on Syria during the war took place in 2013. It targeted a convoy of advanced missiles bound for Hezbollah. That was the beginning. Over the next years, Israel conducted hundreds of air raids in Syria. Some hit weapons shipments. Some hit Iranian bases. Some hit senior IRGC commanders. The pace was relentless. The targets were chosen carefully. Israel didn't want to topple Assad. It wanted to bleed out Iran's presence without getting sucked into the war. Iran wasn't blind to what was happening. It buried weapons deeper underground. It spread out its facilities. It used civilian infrastructure as shields. But it couldn't hide everything. Israel's intelligence network inside Syria was deep. It knew where things were being built, who was visiting, what kind of missiles were arriving. And every time Israel struck, it made one thing clear. There would be no Iranian front in Syria. Not now, not ever. The Russians entered the Syrian conflict in late 2015, siding with Assad. That complicated things. Israel didn't want to risk hitting Russian forces by mistake. So a strange arrangement emerged. Israeli and Russian military officials began coordinating through a deconfliction hotline. Israel would notify Moscow before strikes, ensuring Russian assets were not harmed. This allowed Israeli airstrikes to continue, even as Russian jets patrolled the skies. Iran, meanwhile, was building a network of militias and weapons factories, trying to dig in, to outlast the strikes, to plant roots. One of the most dramatic moments came in February of 2018. An Iranian drone crossed into Israeli airspace. It was shot down. In response, Israel launched a wave of strikes on Syrian and Iranian targets. An Israeli F-16 was shot down by Syrian air defenses, the first time an Israeli jet had been lost in decades. It marked a dangerous escalation. Syria had become not just a transit point, but a combat zone between two powers who weren't officially at war. And every incident risked turning a Cold War hot. Israel's strikes grew bolder. It began targeting airports like Damascus International, where Iranian weapons shipments were flown in. It bombed warehouses, command centers, radar stations. Some of the attacks were carried out in broad daylight. Others were silent, never claimed, but unmistakably Israeli. The goal was always the same: deny Iran the ability to use Syria as a military launchpad. Iran adapted. It focused on entrenchment through proxies. It trained local militias. It recruited Syrians into groups modeled after Hezbollah. It experimented with smuggling routes through Iraq, using the chaos of the region to build a land bridge that stretched from Tehran to Beirut. Israeli drones and satellites watched every inch of that corridor, and whenever a new weapons lab or transit point appeared, explosions soon followed. There were assassinations too. Iranian commanders were killed in airstrikes near the Golan. Hezbollah officers were taken out in surgical hits. Sometimes the targets were in moving cars, sometimes in buildings. The message was always the same: we see you, we will find you. Syria became a graveyard not just for Syrians, but for foreign operatives playing a deadly game behind the scenes. In 2019, tensions spiked again. Israeli strikes hit deep into Syria, reaching as far as Aleppo and even near the Iraqi border. Iran responded by trying to launch rockets into Israel. Some were intercepted, others failed to launch. Israel replied with more strikes, often taking out entire Iranian facilities in minutes. Yet neither side officially acknowledged the war they were fighting. It remained a silent battlefield, loud only in explosions and funerals. Meanwhile, the Syrian people were caught in the middle. Their country was being carved up by outside forces: Russia, Iran, Turkey, the United States, Israel, all playing their games, chasing their interests. For Syrians, the sky brought drones and missiles from every direction. Cities were bombed, rebuilt, and bombed again. And beneath the rubble, the proxy war between Israel and Iran kept simmering. One of the most important changes was how the Golan Heights shifted from a dormant front to a potential flashpoint. Iran-backed militias began moving closer to Israel's border. Observation posts were set up. Rocket launch pads were detected. Israel warned and then struck. In 2020, an airstrike near the Golan killed several Hezbollah operatives. Israel released aerial footage and said, "We won't allow Iran to turn Syria into Lebanon." That phrase summed up the whole strategy. Lebanon was already packed with over 100,000 Hezbollah rockets. Israel could not accept a second front just kilometers from its heartland. Throughout all this, the United States largely stayed out of the Syria-Iran-Israel triangle. American troops were in Syria to fight ISIS and protect Kurdish forces, but Washington did not interfere with Israeli airstrikes. If anything, it offered support. The Pentagon occasionally provided satellite intel, but it was Israel's war to fight. And fight it did. Systematically, ruthlessly, and quietly. By the early 2020s, Israel claimed to have carried out over 1,000 airstrikes in Syria. Some reports said the number was even higher. Iranian forces in Syria had taken heavy losses. Some withdrew, others changed tactics, but the project never stopped. Iran kept trying to dig in, Israel kept pushing them out, and Syria remained the land in between, shattered by its civil war and carved apart by forces far beyond its borders. And through it all, the silence persisted. Israel rarely acknowledged its operations. Iran rarely admitted its casualties. And Syria, once the heart of the Arab world, became a theater, not for headlines, but for whispers. a place where two bitter enemies fought a war with no banners, no declarations, and no end in sight. By the start of the year 2020, the Israel-Iran conflict had reached a strange kind of rhythm. Nothing was ever declared, no formal battles, no speeches saying, "This is war." But the air kept shaking in the dead of night, and the bodies kept piling up in places that didn't make the evening news. It was a war that moved in shadows, and by this point, it had picked up speed. The strikes were no longer just in Syria. They stretched across Iraq, into Lebanon, even inside Iran itself. And suddenly, the war that had been off the books was becoming impossible to ignore. In January of the year 2020, the whole region held its breath. That was the month when an American drone sliced through the sky above Baghdad and killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's Quds force. It was a surgical strike, but the tremors were global. Soleimani wasn't just a general, he was Iran's spy master, strategist, and symbol of regional power. He had helped build the entire axis of influence, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the militias in Iraq and Syria. When the US took him out, Iran promised revenge. The world assumed they'd go after America. But deep inside Israeli intelligence circles, no one exhaled. Because while the trigger had come from Washington, Tel Aviv was always part of Soleimani's war map. And Iran didn't forget. The year didn't calm down. COVID-19 swept the globe, but the shadow war didn't stop for lockdowns. If anything, it expanded. Israel intensified its campaign in Syria, hitting convoys, storage depots, and airfields. And then the strikes moved east, into Iraq. Iran had been using Iraqi territory to move weapons and build infrastructure away from Israeli jets. But soon, warehouses in western Iraq began to explode under mysterious circumstances. Militias trained by Iran started losing commanders, and the feeling spread. Nowhere was safe anymore. Then came the cyber attacks. Israel had always led in cyber capabilities, but now it was unleashing them in new, aggressive ways. In April of the year 2020, hackers linked to Israel targeted Iran's Shahid Raja'i port, one of its major shipping hubs. The attack caused days of chaos. Computers went down, cargo stacked up, ships couldn't dock. It was a message: we can hit you without firing a single missile. Iran got the message and returned one of its own. In May, an attempt was made to poison Israel's water supply. Hackers tried to change the chemical levels in water treatment plants, hoping to harm civilians. The attack was blocked in time, but it raised the stakes. Civilians were now directly in the line of fire, not through bombs, but through code. Cyber became the new battlefield, and the gloves were off. The same year, Iranian scientists started dying, not in war zones, but on quiet streets. In November of the year 2020, Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated outside Tehran. The attack was stunning, not just because of who he was, but how it happened. Reports described a remote-controlled machine gun hidden in a car, using artificial intelligence to track its target. It killed him in seconds, with surgical precision, without harming his wife sitting inches away. Iran blamed Israel immediately. Israel, as always, said nothing. But the world understood. This wasn't just about stopping a program. It was psychological warfare. It told Iran, we know your face, we know your route, and we don't need to be near you to reach you. Inside Iran, the atmosphere grew darker. Scientists and generals traveled in convoys, checked under their cars, and switched routes. But paranoia couldn't stop the bleeding. Infrastructure across the country began to suffer mysterious fires and explosions. A power station here, a missile factory is there. Even Natanz, the heart of Iran's uranium enrichment effort, was hit. In July, an explosion tore through the site, damaging advanced centrifuges. The timing was surgical, the effect was humiliating, and Tehran knew exactly who was behind it, even if the world didn't hear it said aloud. But Iran wasn't only losing ground, it was building elsewhere, especially in Lebanon. Hezbollah began upgrading its rocket arsenal, Not just more rockets, but better ones. Precision-guided, capable of hitting within meters of their targets. Israel watched this unfold with increasing alarm. For years, Hezbollah had relied on sheer volume, firing hundreds of unguided missiles in a swarm. Now they were moving toward quality, and a few hundred guided missiles could do more damage than thousands of dumb ones. In response, Israel shifted its focus. It launched covert operations in Lebanon, not to strike yet, but to gather. Satellites zoomed in, spies tracked convoys, surveillance drones circled low and slow, and when necessary, bombs were planted, not just to destroy weapons, but to destroy momentum. One strike in Beirut's port area reportedly hit a facility linked to Iran's missile project. Officials stayed quiet. The message stayed loud. The pace of airstrikes in Syria didn't slow. 2021 saw some of the most frequent Israeli operations yet. Damascus, Homs, Deir ez-Zor, all were hit. Iran continued trying to ship weapons and reinforce its presence. Israel continued taking it apart. Even Iranian planes bringing supplies were watched the moment they touched down. At one point, an Iranian cargo flight landed in Damascus, unloaded, and minutes later, the entire warehouse storing those goods was in flames. The precision was relentless. The denials, routine. Meanwhile, in the Red Sea, another front opened. Iranian ships suspected of smuggling arms or intelligence were hit with limpet mines. One vessel, the Saviz, was anchored for months off Yemen's coast, officially labeled a cargo ship, but widely known to be an IRGC base floating at sea. In April of the year 2021, it was damaged by an explosion, likely underwater. Iran accused Israel. Israel didn't blink. The maritime war had begun. By now, the entire region felt it. Rockets were launched at U.S. bases in Iraq, many blamed on Iran-backed militias. Israel's Iron Dome intercepted incoming fire from Gaza and Lebanon. Syrian air defenses lit up nightly skies. And still, none of it was declared. There were no grand speeches, just a growing sense that the air had changed. The pace had quickened. The limits were fading. In May of the year 2021, Israel fought an 11-day war with Hamas in Gaza. Over 4,000 rockets were fired at Israeli cities. But this time, something was different. Some of the weapons used had Iranian fingerprints, not just ideologically, but technically. There were drones, guided systems, more accurate barrages. The streets of Tel Aviv echoed with sirens night after night, and Israeli jets pounded Gaza harder than ever before. Behind every explosion was the growing realization that Iran's support for its proxies was no longer symbolic, it was operational. Inside Iran, the nuclear program pushed forward. In April of the year 2022, another sabotage attack hit Natanz. Centrifuges were damaged. The site went dark for hours. Again, Israel was blamed. Again, it said nothing. But Iran responded by enriching uranium even further, getting closer to weapons-grade levels. The spiral tightened. By the time the calendar turned to the year 2023, the shadow war was no longer quiet. Iranian officials were killed in Damascus in precision strikes. Militias in Iraq and Syria were losing commanders weekly. Israel raised its defense alert on every border, north, south, east. And inside Iran, cyber disruptions increased. Power grids flickered, government websites went down, banks glitched, and in each case, the question hovered in the air, was this just a test or a message? Then came October of that year. The tension was thick. Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, the West Bank, all pulsing with unrest. Israeli jets roared nightly. Iran's foreign ministry gave statements filled with fury, but empty of confirmation. And the sense that something larger might be coming hung like smoke that won't blow away. But no one said the word war. Not yet. Not officially. Because in this chapter of the Israel-Iran conflict, silence was still the loudest weapon of all. On the morning of October 7, 2023, Israel woke up to a sound it had heard many times before. sirens. But this time, something was wrong. The sirens didn't stop. They screamed over Ashkelon, Sderot, Tel Aviv, and then even further inland. And the rockets didn't come in waves. They came like a flood, one after another, hundreds at a time. The sky turned into a battlefield. For years, people had grown used to the Iron Dome taking care of things. But even the Iron Dome has limits. That morning, it couldn't keep up, but the rockets weren't even the worst part. While eyes looked up, death came from the ground. Dozens of armed Hamas fighters had crossed into Israel by air, by land, and even by sea. They used paragliders to drop into towns. They blew holes through border fences. They rode motorcycles through security gaps. And within hours, they were inside Israeli communities, going door to door with rifles, grenades, and fire. They weren't just attacking soldiers. They were killing civilians. Entire families were shot in their homes. People at a music festival in the desert were hunted down. The scale was unlike anything Israel had seen since its founding. The Israeli response was brutal and immediate. Warplanes screamed into the skies over Gaza. Airstrikes hit towers, tunnels, and entire city blocks. It wasn't the usual exchange. It was a declaration, silent but loud. Within days, Gaza was burning. The ground invasion began. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. But something felt different this time. Something larger was moving behind the curtain. Because no one believed that Hamas had pulled this off alone. All eyes turned toward Iran. From the very first hours, intelligence agencies started tracing the planning, the weapons, and the money. And the lines led back to Tehran. Iran had long funded Hamas, trained its fighters, and supplied the blueprints for the tunnels and rockets. But this was something else. This was scale, coordination, timing. And it sent a message that went beyond Gaza. The axis Iran had spent years building. Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the militias in Iraq, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. It was now acting like a network, not a slogan. Iran, of course, denied direct involvement. They praised the attack. They called it a natural response to occupation, but they said they didn't plan it. Still, everyone watching knew that Hamas had neither the technological capability nor the strategic boldness to launch something like this without green lights flashing in the background. Israel didn't wait for proof. It sent its jets into overdrive. The war that followed was relentless. Israeli troops pushed into Gaza, house to house, tunnel to tunnel. Hamas fired thousands more rockets. The death toll soared. Civilians were caught in the middle. Hospitals overflowed. Bodies lined the streets. But beneath the horror, something else was shifting. Hezbollah began firing from Lebanon. Not in full force, but enough to open a second front. Israel responded with artillery and airstrikes in the north. In Syria, Israeli planes bombed Damascus International Airport twice in 1 week, believing it was being used to move weapons. Iraq's militias began firing drones toward Israeli territory, and in the Red Sea, the Houthis started targeting cargo ships, claiming solidarity with Gaza. It was no longer just a war in Gaza. It was a regional firestorm, and every match had been soaked in Iranian oil. What made this moment different wasn't just the violence, it was how openly the pieces moved. In the past, things had happened in shadows, explosions no one claimed, assassinations no one confirmed. But now, militias proudly filmed their rocket launches. Hezbollah posted drone footage of Israeli bases. Iran's supreme leader gave fiery speeches declaring that Israel's defeat had begun. The coded language was gone. The masks were slipping. Inside Israel, everything changed. For years, the country had lived with tension, but this attack shattered something deeper. The myth of security, the belief that the fences, the drones, the intelligence, the layers of defense would always hold. October 7th proved they could be bypassed in minutes. The shock ran so deep that many Israelis compared it to the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Others said it was worse. This time, the attack had come not from armies, but from fighters who had walked into homes. The emotional weight was unbearable. Families searched for kidnapped loved ones. Videos showing hostages being dragged into Gaza. Some were children, some were elderly. The trauma gripped the country like a fist. And while Israel fought back with overwhelming force, the questions started rising. How did this happen? How did they not see it coming? And behind those questions, another, darker one. Was this the beginning of something much bigger? In Tehran, officials celebrated. They didn't dance in the streets, but the tone was unmistakable. State television ran clips of Hamas rockets and Israeli funerals. Analysts praised the strategy. The Axis had flexed, and Israel had flinched. Whether or not Iran gave the order, they understood the impact. It showed that Israel could bleed, that the alliances being built against Iran, Israel with the Gulf states, Israel with the West, could be shaken with one bold strike. Meanwhile, the United States moved quickly. Warships were deployed to the eastern Mediterranean. President Biden gave speeches of support and warnings to Iran. Troops were sent to the region as a deterrent. The goal was clear: keep this from turning into a full regional war. But it was already moving in that direction. Every day brought new rocket fire. Every night, new strikes. And every corner of the region, from Baghdad to Beirut, was feeling the aftershocks. In Gaza, the destruction was catastrophic. No electricity, no clean water, communications cut off, entire families buried in rubble. The humanitarian crisis deepened, but neither side backed down. Hamas refused to release all the hostages. Israel refused to stop the bombing. And in between, the sense of escalation became a drumbeat. Not fast, not sudden, but steady. The kind of escalation that creeps until it can't be undone. The most disturbing part was how it all felt like it had been waiting to happen. For years, the tension had been rising, the strikes getting bolder, the proxy forces better armed. But October 7th broke the illusion that the line between war and peace was still intact. And once that illusion shattered, everything that followed became more dangerous. Every strike carried the risk of spiraling. Every rocket could lead to a wider fight. And somewhere behind it all, Iran was watching, calculating, preparing, and waiting for the next move. By April of the year 2024, the war between Israel and Iran could no longer be called a shadow war. It was still undeclared, but it was no longer quiet. The gloves were off. And for the first time in decades, missiles and drones began crossing borders, not just between Israel and its neighbors, but between Israel and Iran itself. The axis of confrontation stretched wide, from Gaza to Lebanon, from Syria to Iraq, but now it was stretching deep into the heart of each nation's homeland. This was a different chapter, and everyone could feel it. The moment that flipped the switch came early in April, when Israel carried out an airstrike in Syria that killed Mohammad Reza Zahedi, a high-ranking commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, along with other top Iranian officers. The target wasn't in a remote field. It was a building in Damascus, not far from diplomatic quarters. The blast was so powerful it punched through floors of reinforced concrete. Zahedi wasn't just any commander. He was a key figure in the IRGC's Quds force, directly overseeing Iranian operations in Syria and Lebanon. Killing him wasn't a message. It was a challenge. Iran didn't pretend to shrug it off. Just days after the Damascus strike, Tehran made it clear that a red line had been crossed. But instead of sending messages through proxies or filing a complaint at the United Nations, they launched something Israel had never seen on this scale. On the night of April 13th, Iran fired over 320 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones directly at Israeli territory, from inside Iran itself. It was the first time in history that Iran had launched such an overt, direct attack on Israel from its own soil. For decades, everything had been through Hezbollah, Hamas, or militias elsewhere. But this was unmistakable. This was Tehran speaking in its own voice. And what followed was one of the most intense nights in Israeli military history. Sirens screamed from the Negev desert to the northern hills. Fighter jets scrambled. Missile defense systems lit up the sky. U.S. forces in the region even helped intercept some of the threats. In the end, nearly all the incoming missiles and drones were shot down before they hit. But the shock wasn't in the damage. It was in the act itself. Because once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Iran had declared without words that it was ready to play openly. And now, the world watched to see how Israel would respond. It didn't take long. Within a week, Israeli jets struck deep into Iranian territory. For years, Iran's air defenses had been focused on protecting nuclear sites like Natanz and Fordow, but this time, Israel struck a military facility in Isfahan, a city with strong symbolic weight, home to some of Iran's missile and drone infrastructure. The blast was heard across the province. Israel didn't issue a statement. It didn't need to. Everyone knew who had sent the warplanes. The world gasped, but neither side blinked. It had become a strange kind of war, not all-out invasion, not yet, but a controlled fire spreading across capitals. Meanwhile, Hezbollah ramped up its fire from Lebanon, testing Israel's northern front with daily rocket fire. Militias in Iraq and Syria tried to hit Israeli positions with drones. The Houthis in Yemen resumed targeting ships linked to Israel in the Red Sea. And inside Gaza, the war that began in the previous October continued to grind on, with both sides locked in blood and rubble. In Tel Aviv, the mood hardened. What had started as a defensive posture had now become a full-scale strategic campaign. Israeli intelligence focused even more sharply on Iranian command nodes, missile development sites, and UAV factories. Every general was a target, every warehouse a suspect. The Israeli public, rattled by the unprecedented Iranian strike in April, now understood. This wasn't just about proxies anymore. Tehran had taken off its mask. In Tehran, the atmosphere grew tense. Air defenses were placed on alert across major cities. Military leaders rotated sleeping locations, expecting another wave of strikes. Revolutionary Guard commanders traveled in convoys, their phones turned off, their locations encrypted. But anxiety wasn't enough to stop them. Iran continued moving weapons into Syria and Lebanon. It rushed precision guidance kits for Hezbollah's missiles. It increased funding to Hamas and the Houthis. It wasn't backing down. It was digging in. The Americans stayed heavily involved. U.S. troops were not engaged directly in the strikes between Israel and Iran, but the Pentagon reinforced its bases across the region. Air defense systems were repositioned. Naval groups were stationed along choke points. And Washington kept up pressure on Iran through sanctions, statements, and behind-the-scenes warnings. But in the end, it was Israel and Iran shaping the course now, not Washington or Moscow or Brussels. By the middle of the summer, the tit-for-tat escalations had settled into a dangerous rhythm. Israel hit weapons convoys in Iraq. Iran's proxies launched more rockets at Israeli bases. A drone strike killed another IRGC advisor in Syria. And again, the question circled the world like smoke. How long can this hold before it all explodes? But the most terrifying part wasn't just the attacks. It was how normal they had started to feel. A missile over Isfahan, a drone over Eilat, a strike in Damascus, a blackout in Beirut, and somehow none of it shocked anyone anymore. The unthinkable had become part of the calendar. Security experts stopped talking in terms of if and started talking in terms of when. Meanwhile, civilians paid the price. In Israel, families built bomb shelters into their daily lives. Schools practiced evacuation drills. People in Tel Aviv checked the sky before leaving work. In Iran, power stations were fortified. Airports increased security. National television warned citizens to expect external threats. It wasn't war in the traditional sense, but it wasn't peace either. It was something more dangerous, a limbo with a short fuse. And all across the Middle East, the winds shifted. Arab states that had once hoped to stay on the sidelines began to rethink their positions. Some condemned the attacks, others stayed quiet, watching carefully. The Abraham Accords, which had brought new diplomatic ties between Israel and countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, were suddenly tested. What happens when regional stability is no longer an abstract concern, but a missile falling from the sky? By October of the year 2024, the region looked different. The smoke hadn't cleared, the war hadn't ended, but something fundamental had changed. Israel and Iran were now engaged in open confrontation. No more pretending, no more quiet sabotage. The war wasn't total, not yet. But the rules that had once kept it in the shadows had been burned away in the fire. By January of the year 2025, the illusion that this was a localized conflict had completely shattered. What had once been framed as an Israeli security concern or an Iranian regional ambition was now something much bigger. The war had dragged in allies, rattled global economies, shifted old alliances, and started carving new lines across the world map. What began in the shadows between two countries had now grown into something that looked and felt like a global crisis, and the world could no longer afford to look away. Inside Israel, the situation had transformed. The October war with Hamas never truly ended. Israeli forces continued operations in Gaza, digging deeper into the tunnel networks, fighting a war that had long since moved past phases and deadlines. Civilian life struggled to return to normal. Reserve soldiers were still being called up. The country's defense budget ballooned. Air defense batteries covered the landscape like permanent fixtures. For the first time in decades, Israelis seriously discussed the possibility of a long-term, multi-front war becoming a permanent feature of their existence. Lebanon burned with tension. Syria crackled with risk. And every time an Iranian advisor died in Damascus or an Israeli jet crossed into Iraqi airspace, the temperature ticked higher. In Iran, the political climate had grown darker. The public, already fatigued by years of sanctions and economic pressure, began to feel the consequences of open war. Prices soared, power shortages increased, travel restrictions tightened, and all the while, the Revolutionary Guard doubled down. More troops moved to the western frontiers. More missile sites were constructed in underground bunkers. The country's leadership, publicly defiant but privately calculating, pushed forward with its strategy of confrontation and deterrence. But now, their cities were within range of Israeli missiles. And for all their influence through proxies, the prospect of a direct hit on Tehran or Esfahan was no longer far-fetched. But what made this moment different from everything before was the global ripple. Oil markets panicked with every strike on Iranian infrastructure. Container ships changed routes after even a single drone was spotted over the Red Sea. Insurance rates for vessels in the Persian Gulf tripled overnight. Energy prices in Europe and Asia began to reflect the growing danger that any Israeli strike on Iran or any Iranian retaliation could light up the Strait of Hormuz and choke off the flow of oil to half the planet. Then came the diplomatic fractures. Western capitals, once unified in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, started splintering. The United States, still Israel's closest ally, remained committed on paper, but tensions grew. Behind closed doors, Washington urged restraint, fearing that a full-scale Israeli assault on Iranian soil would trigger a chain reaction no one could contain. In Europe, protests erupted. Some governments criticized Israel's operations. Others condemned Iran's regional destabilization. But very few had answers. And as the conflict crept into cyber attacks, port sabotage, and airspace violations, even countries far from the Middle East began asking the same question. How far is this going to go? In China and Russia, the response was different. Both saw opportunity in the chaos. Russia, already deeply entangled in Ukraine, watched Israel's military operations with interest. Iran became even more valuable to Moscow as a weapons supplier, as a counterweight to NATO, and as a testing ground for tactics. China, meanwhile, kept its cards close. Beijing expressed concern over regional instability, but quietly moved to secure its shipping lanes and energy deals. Diplomats held secret talks with Tehran. Trade continued, and just beneath the surface, the great power chessboard began to shift. Meanwhile, the Abraham Accords, once hailed as a breakthrough between Israel and its Arab neighbors, were hanging by a thread. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco had all normalized ties with Israel, hoping for economic growth and strategic advantage. But now they found themselves walking a tightrope. On one side, a public increasingly enraged by images from Gaza and Lebanon. On the other hand, trade deals, security cooperation, and the fear of Iran. Their silence grew louder by the day. And behind the scenes, they reevaluated every handshake, every embassy, every shared intelligence file. Inside the United Nations, paralysis returned. Resolutions were vetoed, emergency meetings were held and dismissed. Each side accused the other of war crimes. Civilian death tolls mounted, but no global body could intervene. Everyone was too invested, too divided, too afraid to get dragged in. The world's institutions watched, but did not move, and the vacuum they left was filled with fire. At the grassroots level, the conflict bled into everyday life around the world. Protests erupted in Western capitals, some in support of Israel, some against it, many simply screaming for peace. Social media turned into a battlefield of its own. Every explosion had a hashtag. Every death became a symbol, and people who had never cared about geopolitics suddenly found themselves pulled into arguments that traced back 75 years or more. The war wasn't just on television. It was in classrooms, in dinner table conversations, in algorithms deciding what people saw and believed. And still, the missiles flew. In May of the year 2025, a drone strike killed another senior Iranian figure in Syria. Israel didn't confirm, but everyone knew. In response, a series of rockets hit the Golan Heights. The damage was limited, but the symbolism wasn't. The war had no front lines anymore. The front lines were everywhere. And through it all, the question that had once lived in the background now stood front and center. Is this still a conflict between two nations, or has it become something bigger? Because when a war involves superpowers, chokes sea routes, disrupts energy flows, and inflames half the world's population, it's no longer just a regional rivalry. It's a crisis with no off switch. But there was one thing both Israel and Iran still had in common. Neither side had declared war. That word, with all its weight and history, still hadn't been used. No peace, no truce, no negotiations, just action, response, retaliation, over and over. Because in this war, words had stopped mattering. Missiles spoke louder. Explosions rewrote the boundaries. And every sunrise came with the quiet dread that somewhere, someone would strike again. And that's where the world now stood. Not at peace, not in full war, but in a suspended state of danger where any spark could light a fire that no one, not Tehran, not Tel Aviv, not Washington, not Moscow, could put out.